Welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. This is Tara Johnson-Noem, your host. We are going to let everyone in who's joining us via Zoom, and then we will get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. If you're just joining us via Zoom or on Facebook, we are going to give everybody on Zoom just a moment to get into the meeting from the waiting room, and we will be starting momentarily with Northern Kentucky History Hour, episode 42, Women of Densmore. And again, if you're just now tuning in or just joining us on Zoom, thank you so much for being here tonight with Northern Kentucky History Hour. I'm your host, Tara Johnson-Noem, and we are still letting people into the meeting, so just going to pause for another half a minute or so and let everyone in, and then we will begin. Let's see. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome to Northern Kentucky History Hour. Again, for those of you that are just coming in, and a lot of us are still coming in from the waiting room, my name is Tara Johnson-Noem. I am one of the museum trustees for Behringer-Crawford Museum. It's so nice to see all of you tonight, your names, and some of you, your faces. This is episode 42 of Northern Kentucky History Hour, and it is all about the Women of Densmore. I can't wait to introduce you to tonight's speaker, but I do have a couple of things that we're going to cover first. First, you might notice that your speaker is muted, but that doesn't mean that we don't want you to take part. So please add questions, add comments in the chat. If you're on Facebook, we would love to see your comments. I watch those too on the comment section, and I will be taking notes throughout the presentation, and then I'll ask your question at the end. Some of you like to follow our quiz. We will be having a quiz tonight. In addition to bragging rights, the winner of the quiz gets one of our little buttons that says Northern Kentucky History Hour. So when it's time for the quiz, get your fingers ready. The first correct answer wins the prize. So I also want to take a moment. I see so many familiar names, and I want to thank the museum staff for supporting this crazy volunteer project that my husband Shane Noem and I came up with almost a year ago now. The museum staff make it work, and we just want to say thank you so much to them. Thank you to my fellow trustees for kind of supporting us in this effort. And I also want to thank the financial contributors of Behringer-Crawford Museum. We're supported by the City of Covington, Kenton County Fiscal Court, Arts Wave, the Kentucky Arts Council, Northern Kentucky Sports Hall of Fame, and the Carol Ann and Ralph V. Hale Jr. U.S. Bank Foundation. Thanks to all of those supporters, and thank you to our members. We have gotten a lot of new members through this initiative, and I just want to say thank you to every single one of you for supporting us over this crazy year. And if you're not a member yet, you can find out how to do that at bcmuseum.org. Okay, now for the best part. This is why everybody's joining. We have a great turnout tonight to meet our guest, Cathy Collopy. Cathy has been a Dinsmore Homestead Museum staff member for more than 20 years. And before that, she taught 8th grade U.S. history in Kenton County. In addition to her museum work, she has taught a variety of history courses at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash, Xavier University, and Northern Kentucky University. I got to see a few sneak peeks of some of her photos earlier today, and I know that I cannot wait for this presentation. So Cathy, welcome.
Thank you. And thanks to Tara and Shane for including Dinsmore in this. And thanks to Behringer-Crawford Museum. This is a wonderful idea. And let's see. So,
you're good.
Does that work?
That works. And then you just want to do
a
start presentation if you want.
Yes.
So full screen.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the women of Dinsmore. Now, there were men at Dinsmore. I'm not dissing any of the men at Dinsmore, but I was coming up with a title in March, and it was Women's History Month. So, and there are quite a few women at Dinsmore to pick from. So I thought I would do this presentation on women. And I'm going to focus on 4 women. And I think one of the wonderful things about Dinsmore is that we have lots of artifacts and documents so that we can actually retell the stories. Not exactly, we can't get into real personal details, but we can retell the stories of people who lived on the farm, worked on the farm, or were associated with the family. So that's one of the things that I think helps to make us unique. So we're going to talk about how these women were shaped by the environment they lived in and how they tried to shape the environment themselves. First of all, to talk about Dinsmore, we do open this weekend, but this is a farm that is a historic site now and open for tours. And because it's a farm site, we do have the main house, which was built in 1842. But we also have lots of other buildings on the farm. So we have a building that since 1870 has been used as a kitchen up until 1916. But at one point it may have actually housed enslaved people. We also have a wine house, an ice house, a carriage house, 2 barns, the remains of a sheep barn, a graveyard, and other buildings. So all original structures. Not everything has survived, but what is there, what is on the farm is original. In addition to that, the main house has all original artifacts. And there aren't a lot of museums in the United States that are as lucky as we are. So the family left, they gave the property to the foundation in 1987, 88. And they said they wanted it to feel like you're walking into the house and the people who live there had just stepped out to visit the neighbors. And when you walk in, it does feel like you're walking back in time. The artwork, the books, everything is original to the family. We do have receipts for a lot of the artifacts that we have. And we do have a receipt from 1842 from McAlpin's. So lots of receipts from Shillito's, a chair from Pogue's. So we're as much a Cincinnati museum as we are a Northern Kentucky museum. The 90,000 pages of letters, journals, and receipts that we have help to make us, unique in that sense also. The family seemed to keep everything. So we can tell something about the lives of the people who lived in the house, but also I think we're lucky in that we can tell something about the lives of the people who worked for the family. Definitely some of this you're getting from the Dinsmore perspective, but it is still some information that you can glean from that. Even though the Dinsmores lived in what would seem like a backwater of Boone County, in a little corner near Bellevue Bottoms, they happened to, probably through their good education and some of their relationships, they got to know people who were rich and famous. And we do like to point that out on tours. That helps to make us part of the national story. So one of the cousins was B.F. Goodrich. James's great-granddaughter was the first congresswoman from Arizona, the only non-Roosevelt in Eleanor and Franklin's wedding party. We have Uncle Silas Dinsmore, who was named agent to the Cherokee and then the Choctaw. Enid Yandell, we have a bas relief of Julia Dinsmore done by Enid Yandell, one of the first women sculptors in Kentucky. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt. And then there's some actors and actresses. So the trivia question for tonight is, we know that Silas Dinsmore had a close relationship with John Ross. And John Ross was the last Eastern chief of the Cherokee. And he went on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. So my question is, how were we able to figure out that Silas Dinsmore had a close relationship with John Ross. So at the end, I will tell you the answer, but make a good guess. We do have school groups every year. We see about every year that is not a pandemic year, we see about 3,000 school children of various ages. For the younger children, we emphasize the difference between life today and life a long time ago. For the older children, we do a little more critical thinking about the different groups who lived and worked on the farm. In the summertime, we have camps. So we have a pioneer camp that immerses children in the fun of history. And we have an art camp that is much more modern focused, but takes advantage of the wonderful natural situation we're in. So that's a little bit about Dinsmore. About the 4 women. So the first of the women is Julia Stockton Dinsmore. And she is the one, if you take a tour, you will hear the most about, because she lived in the house for 84 years. So she came to the house when she was 9. She died in 1926, and she always considered the Boone County farm her home. So a lot of things in the house relate to Julia, and the furniture is pretty much the way she left it. Julia was born on her father's Bayou Black plantation in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. She had an older sister, Isabella, and a younger sister, Susan. Neither of her parents, though, were from the Deep South. So James Dinsmore was born in New Hampshire. His wife, Martha McComb, was born in New York City. But James had slowly made his way south until he ended up in Louisiana, running a plantation where he had 80 enslaved people working for him. In 1842, he decided to move up to Kentucky. Over the ensuing 30 years, Susan died in a drowning accident at the age of 15 up in Lake Erie. Mrs. Dinsmore died, and we don't really know why, because everyone was at home, so no one wrote about it in a letter. And Isabella, Julia's older sister, married and moved away from home to Minnesota. She came back when she was pregnant twice, gave birth to 2 little girls, returned to Minnesota after the second birth, and died 6 months later. So we believe it was some sort of complication from the pregnancy or from the childbirth itself. Julia brought the 2 girls down to Kentucky and raised them as her own. In 1872, then, James died, and Julia was the only child left in the family. So she inherited a farm that was 380 acres at a time in 1872 when women weren't running things like farms. So today it wouldn't be that odd. That at that time it was pretty bad. It just wasn't, it was rare. Now, Julia had a wonderful education. She went to school in Cincinnati. It was called Miss Cox's Female Seminary for Young Ladies, I believe. And she learned things that mostly boys were learning. So she learned rhetoric, mental philosophy, Latin, algebra, geometry, but none of these things really prepared her for running a farm where most of the workers were white and Black men who, many of them were illiterate, and they weren't used to taking orders from women. Julia kept a journal the entire time she ran the farm. So we have a 54-year journal we're almost finished with. In 1877, she really kind of let it out in her journal. Now, her journal was not an emotional thing. It was to notice, let's see, how many pigs died on a certain day, what she was paying her tenants, who came to work, who didn't come to work, very business oriented. But at one point in 1877, she overpaid one of her tenants 50 cents. And it made her so angry because she knew that she couldn't tell him that she did it and he would believe her. So she poured out her disgust in her journal. I drudge and worry to no avail, lose money and temper and hope. I feel so unlike a lady in my external that I have no doubt I shall soon be less a lady in reality, associating only with coarse people, all against me in their own interest, and never having one day of leisure or pleasure in which I can be my own old self again. So here's young lady in her 30s, used to wearing a hoop skirt and going to parties, all of a sudden having to work on a farm and finding it very difficult. The men she worked with didn't trust her judgment. When she said she would pay them a certain amount, they had to have other men in the neighborhood intervene if they didn't think what she was doing was fair. So she did have two neighbors that she relied on quite a bit. Whenever she went outside of the Grants and the Arnolds, she ended up having some very bad luck with the other men. So this is soon after she inherited the farm. She wrote, Dr. Grant and Mr. Arnold came over as requested and arbitrated Mr. Hunt's claims for us. They agreed that the work he has done cutting briars and bushes and trimming trees is worth $22, and cultivating the young vineyard last year, they agreed was worth $25. So this was something, if you were a man, you really wouldn't have to deal with. But because she was a woman, people really didn't trust her. So she always had to have a man come and say, okay, this is what you need to charge for this, and witness her agreements with some of the tenants. Now, Mr. Hunt didn't last very long. He did not like Julia, but over time, she did start to get some very trustworthy tenants. The Loudon family was one where several generations of the Loudon men worked for Julia, said they would never leave her. And so she did end up getting a hold of how to be a manager on a farm. Julia coped with the ups and downs of farming with help from her nieces. Though they both married and moved away, they did come back every year, and Patty would usually stay several months each year. They corresponded regularly with Julia, whom they called our Oni Mommy, and Julia's letters entertained them with stories of the marital spats, the unnatural deaths, and other troubles of her neighbors, which she saw as the amusing goings-on of rural Kentucky. So in one letter she wrote, "You will see by the paper that Judge Dills has gone where they have all sorts of spirits, but the kind he liked." Much later in 1924, she wrote, "If this wasn't such a funny world, I couldn't have lived in it so long." So she did like to laugh at other people. That kept her going. Nature also kept her going. Even after her screed in her journal, she woke up the next day, saw the green pastures, and she was renewed. So she wrote an awful lot about the flowers, trees, and animals, and that soothed her bad feelings. Every year on her birthday, she trudged up the hills to find the first turkey peas. She wrote lovingly to Patty about a nest of baby buzzards, and she counted the number of violets she could pick in November and then pickled them. And this is from one letter she wrote to Patty. "I walked over in the big pasture in November, this was, saw grasshoppers hopping, plenty of dandelion blooms, and yellow butterflies flying to and fro." So nature was a real calming element for Julia. Even though the farm was work for her, she wouldn't have had it any other way, I believe. As a woman who never married by choice, it gave her an independence that other single women really didn't have. And it gave her her own spot in the world where she could welcome family and friends. And she created a homestead atmosphere and made it a refuge from a really quickly modernizing world. So she wrote one, this was in the 1920s, "Boone has been good enough for me, and if it is on the decline, so am I, and we will go down together. I have seen beauty of all kinds in New York, and style and other ways of life, but I am thankful for my home and elbow room in this crowded world." Julia died in 1926. By her request, she was cremated and buried up on the hill above the house. The next person I'd like to talk about is Nancy Mcgruder. She was born in, we believe, 1810, and we think she was born in Virginia. That's what shows up on two census records. If that is true, that she was born in Virginia, she was one of almost 1 million enslaved people who were moved from the upper South to the deep South in the early decades of the 19th century. James Dinsmore purchased her in 1825. She would have been about 15 years old, and she was already separated from her parents. He put her on a plantation in Mississippi, and in 1829, she moved with the Dinsmore family to the Bayou Black Plantation in Louisiana. When the Dinsmores were moving north to Kentucky, it was assumed that Nancy would stay in Louisiana because she did have, even though marriages weren't legal, she did have a fictive husband, Vincent, and he was owned by someone else, so he could not go to Kentucky. However, when the new owners of the plantation told Nancy that they were going to send her out into the cotton and sugarcane fields to work, she quickly decided that that was a worse fate than leaving Vincent and going up to Kentucky. So she did accompany 10 other enslaved people to Kentucky with the Dinsmore family. We don't know exactly where they lived on the farm, but you can see on the right, there are 2 cabins, and in the far distance is another cabin. And also before this picture, there are 2 other cabins. So we believe. So we don't know what the living arrangements were, but soon after Nancy came to Kentucky, she did join the local Middle Creek Baptist Church. And in 1844, she married a neighbor man who was Noah, and he was owned by the Rice family. Unfortunately, he died before 6 years was out. So by 1850, Nancy was alone again. In September of 1865, Nancy, this was 5 months after the Civil War was over, Nancy Mcgruder decided to leave the farm, and she crossed the Ohio River and made her way to Oxford, Ohio. We aren't really sure why she picked Oxford, but there were other Boone County freed people already settled in Oxford. Most of the freed people from the Dinsmore farm went to Rising Sun. Now, because slavery was still legal in Kentucky, Nancy was kicked out of the local church that she had belonged to for, quote, leaving the state in a disorderly manner and absconding to parts unknown. Up in Oxford, we do find her in the census living with a Barber family. And lucky for us, Nancy was literate. So we believe that Julia and her sisters may have taught Nancy to write and read. So we have several letters that she wrote back to Julia from Oxford. And this is one of them. It's a little difficult to read, but it says, "You know, I would come to see you if I could, and I could not stay with you and please you and the colored people too. It was too hard for me, so I came away. And now I am afraid to travel because, as you know, I have the cramps." So she did suffer from rheumatism, and I think that's what she means by the cramps. But that's one reason, apparently, why she left Boone County, is she could not be nice to the Dinsmore family without upsetting some of the other people on the farm. So another reason, I guess I should say, the Barber family ended up not paying Nancy, even though you can see she was living with the family as a domestic servant. She did find a nice lawyer who was going to sue them to get her money, and he gave the case to someone else, and Nancy never saw her money. But it does list her as white in this. Everything else about this is correct. She mentions the Barbers in letters, so I'm not sure how that happened. But it was probably Mr. Barber giving the census recorder the information. Someone did come to visit her from Rising Sun, a young girl named Annie, and Annie ended up stealing some of her clothes. And what really upset her was that she stole the clothes that Nancy wanted to be buried in. So at 55, well, by 1879, she's 69 years old, almost 70. She not only had to struggle with racism and the limited economic options open to African-American women who had few skills because of enslavement, she also had to deal with a declining health. Another reason why we think Nancy may have left and gone to Oxford is this. She did write Julia, "Miss Julia, where'er I go, I Try to live so I may have some friends. If I get down and cannot help myself, they will care for me when sick. In a later letter, she wrote to Julia that it seemed like she was surrounded by strangers. So she did return to Boone County to the farm in 1879 when there was no one else left in Oxford that she knew very well or that she could count on. She did go back and visit a few times in 1880, 1881, but she didn't stay very long. She always returned to Boone County. So whether in Oxford or in Boone County, Nancy suffered from cataracts, rheumatism, and old age stiffness. My back pains me severely, so I can scarcely stoop down, nor, and I can't see that one word. Still yet, I hope this will reach you and find you enjoying the best of health. So she always did write about her health. Now, how did Nancy cope with all of these negatives? One way she coped was the fact that she did have some independence on the Boone County farm. Julia had a cabin set up for her. They called it Aunt Nancy's cabin. She raised chickens and turkeys. She sold the eggs and the poultry, and she made money for herself. She likely would have had a garden and maybe even some pigs. Unfortunately, in 1886, the cabin burned down. And Julia wrote that it burned up most of her clothes and the money that she had hidden all around the cabin. Julia then moved her into the cook house, the cook kitchen, and that's where she was for the next 20 years. The other thing, other than the independence that she seemed to kind of lose there, that did, and I will go back, she hasn't died yet, that did give her some good feeling was her faith. She had a really strong faith. Now to Julia, her faith was rather doom and gloom. But even though she was kicked out of the local church, she wrote a lot about religion. And Julia said that when she had a bit too much to drink, she and another woman, Eliza, would argue, and Nancy would get so rattled, she would start reciting the Bible verses, and get them kind of confused because she was so angry. When she found out that Julia's niece Patty, who was living in the Dakotas, was hunting, she wrote her a letter and wrote, "Miss Patsy, it is my soul's desire and crave, when you raise your arm up to shoot in the morning, to remember that you have a God. Take God with you to guard you and shield you and keep you. Remember, darling, after death, the judgment. This world is not our home." She died at a very old 96 years old in 1906 and is buried in the family graveyard. She doesn't have an inscribed headstone. She does have a fieldstone marking her grave, and we're pretty sure we have the right one for her. Julia wrote a wonderful letter about getting Nancy ready for the burial. Quote, "She looked surprisingly natural considering how long she lay dying, and Fanny arranged her so straight that one could hardly believe it after her being drawn up for so many months. The cap was a success. It was put on over a head handkerchief of new white lawn, and being too full around the face, I ran a thread around under the frills and drew the fullness around the forehead. We put on what she wished and what she had picked out." The next person I want to talk about is Martha Flandro Selms. She was born on the Dinsmore farm in 1861 and named after her grandmother, Martha McComb, but for the rest of her life, everybody called her Patty, Patsy, or Pat. She was the daughter of Julia's sister, Isabella, and Isabella's husband, Charles Flandro. When Isabella died after giving birth to Patty's sister, Sally, both girls came to Kentucky to live with Julia. Charles, her father, remarried and had 2 boys. When the girls were older, they did start visiting their father in the summertime, and when their education was totally complete, they would go up and spend months and months with him. They both married men who had a connection to St. Paul, Minnesota, where their father lived. Patty attended school in Cincinnati, and like Julia, she went to a really first-rate school. Miss Norse's School for Young Ladies. It was there that she met the Heron sisters, one of whom married William Howard Taft, and she was friends with Jenny Heron, Nellie's sister, for the rest of her life. And she met lots of other well-to-do young ladies in Cincinnati. Her father sent her money to give her a very nice wardrobe, something that she came to expect for the rest of her life. She appreciated the attention that she managed to get from young boys as she grew older. But her father didn't approve. When she was 17, he wrote to her, "My darling, you must remember that you are now nearly a woman and have very soon to take on all the responsibilities of a woman. And further, that if you want to be considered a woman worth seeking for by men worth having, as all sensible women do, you must so act as that no boy or man can ever say you have done an imprudent or indiscreet thing. You are attractive enough and will have all the attention you can desire, no doubt of that. And then will come the question of the happiness or misery of your life. It all depends on that one step." He compared getting married to tying a millstone around your neck. And he encouraged her to wait until she was 21 so that she could make an informed decision about that big choice. She did listen to her father. The week of her 21st birthday, she became engaged to Tilden Selms, shown in this picture, sitting on a bench with her. There were other men interested in her, and we believe that there was a young man that she may have even loved more than Tilden. But she felt sure that her best interest in a most comfortable lifestyle would be gotten with Tilden as a husband. I love this picture because it was done by the boy in the background. He's hiding behind a bush and everything is cut out. The people are cut out and everything else painted in. So that must be one guy that thought that he might get Patty and was pretty mad when Tilden did. Tilden had graduated from Yale, practiced law for a little bit in St. Paul, and then decided to invest his inheritance in a ranch in the Dakota Territory near Mandan, North Dakota today. And he had to purchase cattle and sheep to raise there. That sounded like a lot of fun to Patty because Patty loved riding horses. She was a very good woman on a horse. This is a painting she did of Chantawakpa, what she called their ranch, which is Sioux for Heart River. And they lived out there very happily for a couple of years. By 1885, apparently Tilden was already in debt. It sounds like he had to borrow money to get the sheep and the horses that he wanted on the ranch and the cattle. He spent much of the rest of his life working his way out of debt and just barely staying above water economically. This was not the kind of lifestyle that Patty had envisioned. He died at 40 years old, quite young, and she was 34. Two good things happened while they were in North Dakota. First of all, Patty found out that she was pregnant. Now, this today would be a very happy thing to have happen. We'd all be excited when we're pregnant. She wasn't very excited, and it probably had something to do with the fact that her mother died from complications, we think, of childbirth. She wrote to Julia saying that, "I never was much on living, and I don't care if I die, but what really scared her was being sick for the rest of her life." And that's what she was worried about. But she did come back to Dinsmore Homestead, and she gave birth to Isabella, her daughter there, took her back to the Dakotas with her. Also, while she was out in the Dakotas, she met Teddy Roosevelt, and he became good friends with the Selms family. He described Patty to his sister as the singularly attractive Mrs. Selms, who had a, quote, delicious sense of humor. Their friendship lasted until his death. Eventually, Tilden had to give up on the ranch and lawyering in the Dakotas. He moved back to St. Paul, Minnesota with his family in 1888, and Patty insisted that her father buy them a house, which he did do. They stayed there until 1895, when Tilden was so sick that Patty brought him to a hospital in Cincinnati. They could not diagnose what was wrong with him, so she took him to Johns Hopkins, where he was diagnosed with liver cancer. He wanted to die in Kentucky, so they brought him to the farm, and he died in what we now call the sick room. He is buried in the family graveyard in a burglar-proof coffin. After his death, Patty decided to start a ham business on the farm, and she sent her daughter Isabella up to stay with her grandparents in St. Paul to go to school, and Isabella would come back in the summertime. In 1901, Patty and her daughter moved to New York City to live with their Isabella's Aunt Sally, and Isabella took art classes and finished her schooling there. Patty struggled throughout her life with depression. When her grandfather was dying, the 11-year-old wrote him that she wanted to die too. When Tilden began to have financial troubles in 1885, she wrote to Julia this letter: "What a world of fools and mistakes it is. It is hard to think we will go on blundering willfully or not to the end, that when the key of life is found, it is only to open the gate of death. That life is a bad business and we must make the best of it is rather a doleful conclusion for 23 years to bring. But I wish that 10 had brought it, as I think it the only philosophy worth much." Both Julia and Patty's father, Charles, criticized her lack of economy, and that really was at the heart of her depression. Things had not turned out the way she wanted. She couldn't get the kinds of dresses she wanted. She couldn't lead the social life she wanted, and that upset her. Her poverty also affected her friendships with Corinne Roosevelt Robinson, Teddy's sister, and Susie Parrish, Eleanor Roosevelt's godmother. As the poor friend, she felt that they treated her differently. Patty certainly had different and fewer struggles than Nancy Mcgruder's, but in the 1890s, there was little that a woman like Patty, who cared about position in society, could do to make money. She did try writing. That didn't bring in much. She also did have a bit of a drinking problem for a while, but she was able to overcome that. Some things did give Patty happiness. What she really enjoyed were her relationships with kind of what you would call, I guess, the rich and famous. She knew the Roosevelts, Astors, Parishes, Breckenridges, and others. Even though she may have felt like a poor relation, they invited her to parties, they took her to book readings, symphonies, and even to Europe. When Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, she visited him at the White House several times and wrote to Julia after one visit, quote, "I must get ready to go to lunch and have saved up everything to tell you. The Roosevelts have done me the greatest honor they can do anyone, public and private. I went to Alice's letting out, the diplomatic reception and dinner. I have ridden with the president and dined with his most intimate and trusted friends. There is no one like Theodore, exclamation point." She was also soothed in life by Julia Dinsmore, who listened to her every complaint and always sympathized with her. And Patty always considered the farm in Boone County the safest place on earth. So she wrote this to Julia from, I believe, St. Paul. "The first of next week I leave and do not stop till I reach the dearest resting place on earth, your arms." And Patty died at her daughter's house in New Mexico in 1923. She was brought to Cincinnati, cremated in Clifton, and her ashes were put in Tilden's grave. The last woman I would like to talk about is Susan Riley Roseberry. And Susan was born in Boone County. Susan Riley was born in Boone County in 1884. And she was raised at a time when a lot of African Americans were leaving Boone County and Kentucky for greener fields elsewhere. Her grandfather was a prominent white man in the county, so she was of mixed race. And her father at one point had some property, but we don't know if that ever came down to Susan. She was only 8 years old when her father died. In the 1900 census, the 16-year-old girl is living with a white family in Burlington, Kentucky, working as a servant. Julia Dinsmore hired Susan to come down to the farm and cook and clean for her in 1904, one of the few options available. Harry Roseberry, a young African-American, had been working for Julia for the last 10 years by that time. Not long after Susan arrived, Harry told Julia that he was going to marry Susan. So he may have known her before she got to the farm. They did marry in 1904, and in 1907, Susan had the first of 4 daughters. They named her Cleo, and soon after that, they moved into what Julia had been using as the farm office. Over the many years that the Roseberry family lived on the Dinsmore farm, and Harry stayed into the late 1960s, they built onto this, what the middle part was the original farm office. They built onto both sides, raised 4 daughters and 2 granddaughters there. As a young woman who knew her white cousins and her black cousins, Susan felt keenly whenever she was treated unequally, which did happen quite a bit. She joined the Burlington Baptist Church. We believe she joined. When she would go there, attend services, she was told to sit in the back. She didn't like that at all. So she went across the river and joined the Church in Rising Sun, which was integrated. Julia Dinsmore criticized this decision as proof that somehow Susan lacked real religious fervor. She wasn't serious about religion. Julia herself was really never sympathetic to organized religion anyway, but she also wasn't going to argue with the racial conventions of the time and probably wouldn't have understood why Susan didn't want to sit in the back of the church. Education was another sticking point for Susan. She had only had a 5th grade education, according to the census. Harry probably had even less. When Harry came to the Dinsmore farm, he was going to a local school in rural and somewhere near Bellevue Bottoms. And Julia wrote in her journal that some roughs had burned the school down. They moved to another building and they were kicked out of that. So in the rural parts of the county, it was very hard for African Americans to get a good education. Both Harry and Susie valued education and decided that they were going to send their daughters to Rising Sun, which again had integrated schools. So the young girls would go live with relatives. Harry's family lived over in Rising Sun, and eventually Susan would rent a house over there and stay much of the school year in Rising Sun and return with the girls on vacations. Susan also expressed her independence by refusing to cook and clean for Julia, which I thought was very interesting because Julia was always looking for someone to cook and clean. So the fact that you had this woman who was living very close to Julia, right on the property, and Susan, she would help her clean do the spring cleaning and the fall cleaning, but she did not want to be at Julia's beck and call. She raised chickens and turkeys, she raised pigs, they had a cow, and she helped Harry with a very large garden. So she was able to furnish herself with enough money that she bought a sewing machine, and at one point she bought an organ. Harry also liked music and had a violin. When she was ready to play her organ, she would send her daughters around to some of the tenant wives and tell them, "Mom's going to play the organ, come and listen." And I think she really liked having these white women come and listen to her play the organ. It made her feel equal to some of her neighbors in ways that they probably wouldn't understand. We don't know if Susan struggled with depression or not, but by 1940, Harry, her husband, noticed that something was wrong. And in Boone County, if you suspected someone had mental issues, this is very backward, but you would take them up to the county courthouse and 12 men would come in, and these are farmers and merchants, and they would decide whether they would ask questions of the person who had who was thought to have mental troubles. And if they answered them correctly, then everything was okay. Well, Harry brought Susan back from the courthouse and said she was just too smart for him. Because they didn't think she had any mental issues, and Harry believed that she did. And less than a year later, Susan did take her own life, and she was only in her 50s. So she was buried down the road. This is at a point where Julia's already deceased, so they weren't buried up in the family graveyard. But she is buried down the road, and Harry was buried with her later. So these are just some of the stories. I mean, I feel like at Dinsmore, that's just what makes us special, is that we can tell stories like that. You get a sense, not a complete sense, but you do get a sense of the struggles people had in the past, how they do compare to some of the struggles we have, but also how the time and the space, economy, and race have really made our lives different from the struggles that they had. And that's it.
Wow. Well, those were incredible stories. And we have a lot of questions. So I hope you're ready.
Yes.
Cathy. Let's start though with the answer to the quiz. And actually, if you don't mind, how about you unshare your screen, and then that way we can see your face a little more easily, if that's all right. You just touch where you hit share screen, you just touch that again, and then it unshares it.
Unshare. You are screen sharing, stop share. Okay, got it.
There you go. Yeah, okay. Sorry, not unshare, stop share. Okay, cool. Let's see here. First of all, let's talk about the quiz. So I'm going to go back up here. So at the beginning, you talked about how that Silas Dinsmore had a close relationship with John Ross, who was the last Eastern chief of the Cherokee. Did I get that right?
Yes.
So how were they able to figure that out? And we have a couple answers, but how about you tell us the answer first, and then we'll see if anybody got even close.
He named his son Silas Dinsmore Ross.
There you go. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, nobody got that, but that is a very cool story. I love that. We had a couple of good guesses. We had artifacts in the home, or because relationships that the families had, or DNA tests of documented descendants. I thought that was a good guess. Or letters or correspondence. So those were great, but
we do have a letter.
Okay.
Can we give a pin for the letter?
Well, I will say that I happen to know that the person who guessed the letter might already have a couple of pins.
Oh,
but good job to Janine Kreinbrink.
If it's not special.
Good job for Janine of at least kind of getting a partial answer. So, we have a lot more messages, but I'm gonna start with what we have so far. So this is gonna be kind of in like chronological order from the presentation. So let's start at the very beginning. And you talked about how the Dinsmore family was originally from Louisiana, and you the mention of the Black Bayou plantation. And so one of the audience members, and I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was now, asked if Black Bayou is still standing. Do we know that?
Yes, I went down there before Katrina. We went and stayed at a place that was actually on Bayou Black, that was damaged and I think closed after Katrina, but it's one of the main bayous in Terrebonne Parish. So if you go to Houma, Louisiana, it is there.
Very cool. Okay. And then can you tell us a little bit more about the Dinsmore property as far as how large is it now? And does the property boundary extend to the Ohio River?
At one point it did. So at one point, James owned about 900 acres. So then it did, but he sold off quite a bit before the Civil War. And so that's why Julia inherited, I think she might have inherited 405, but by 1880, it's down to 380, and that's the way it stayed. Now the foundation has about 70 acres. The rest was given to to the State Nature Preserve, and Boone County Parks recently purchased it from them. So there are easements on it, and it's going to stay hopefully relatively untouched. And then we go across the road a little bit down to Middle Creek Road, and that's about it.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. You showed these amazing watercolors of Nancy and some others. Can you talk a little bit about who painted those?
So Patty painted the one of the Chantawakpa Her daughter Isabella painted the ones of Nancy when she would have been 15 years old when she painted those. Yes.
Wow.
And she did the one of the graveyard, I think at the same time. Yes. So there's quite a little art gene running in the family.
Yeah. All right, let's see here. Okay, so going a little bit to the farm side of things for a moment. Now, I don't believe you mentioned this, but maybe one of our audience members who asked this question has been to the homestead recently. The question was, do we know what kinds of grapes they grew? So I'm assuming that means they did grow grapes.
Yes, they had Catawba grapes, and James also wrote about, Isabella grapes.
Very cool. Okay. Did they make wine, or did they
Yes,
sell
he
the
did.
grapes?
So he made wine primarily for his own consumption. He did pay his tenants with it, but he also sold thousands of grape cuttings every year. And in the 1920s, Julia was making grape jelly. So she didn't have as many grapes, and she certainly wasn't making wine, but the vines were still producing.
Wow. That's pretty cool. And grape jelly is, it's pretty good. So that's good. Okay, switching gears again for a moment. There was a picture of some young girls, and one was holding a handbag. This is the only bad thing about doing the questions at the end. And the question is, do we think that the handbag might have been made from, I think it said willow on the estate?
Oh, well, the willows on the estate were really large. So they made like clothes baskets and 4-foot market baskets. So I have not found any small baskets that were made with the same willow. But they did love baskets.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would make very cool. So too big to make like a small handbag with it. Okay. And this is actually my question. I don't know, I tend to like logistics. So you talked about Susan and her daughter's going to school in Rising Sun. And, you did mention that they stayed there kind of during the school year, but was that a ferry that they used to get back and forth? How would they sort of travel back and forth?
Yes, they would catch a ferry, I believe, in the early days at Bellevue Bottoms and Macville, and it would take them down to Rising Sun. When James moved to the farm, Rising Sun is where he got all his mail. So there was a just constant trips over to Indiana. Indiana was considered very close.
Gotcha. It's just interesting to just kind of think about using a boat, on a regular basis to go back and forth. Yeah. Let me see. Okay. Let's see. Okay. And here, I think this is our last question. By the way, Cathy, if you get a second, you should definitely read the chat. We have lots of people who know you and miss you teaching and things, so forth. So you should definitely, actually, there's 2 more questions. Okay. So the first of the 2 is, do you know how many of the enslaved people remained working on the farm after emancipation?
So one family did. Jilson Hawkins and his wife Eliza did until the 1876. Then they had made enough money working for wages to purchase a house in Rising Sun. So they moved to Rising Sun. All the other freed people were in Rising Sun, or most of them, but they would come back and work. So that was another thing where the ferry boat would bring them on a Monday morning, and then they'd go back Friday or Saturday. Over the years, even children of those who had been enslaved would come and work. So there was this connection that they kept. Yeah. So I can't really give it a number. Right. They'd come and go, but
it wasn't a constant. It was more of a.
Right. Yeah. Susan left today. So Ellen came with her daughter and that kind of thing. So as far as males go, very few. Gotcha. They mostly stayed in Rising Sun.
And then this is another example of someone who knows a little bit about that area. So I don't recall you mentioning this name, but maybe you did. I was taking notes, so I think I would have known. But Pat Rafferty would like to know if you can tell us a little bit about Martha Breasted. Am I saying that correctly?
Martha Breasted was Isabella's daughter, so the first Congresswoman's daughter.
There we go.
She was the one who owned the house pretty much.
Okay.
By the time she was one who decided to turn it over as a museum. So supposedly her mother Isabella had thought of doing it, but never got there before she died. So Martha was the one who eventually did it.
Gotcha. And it's so amazing that it continued to be handed down through those generations to be able to maintain the furniture and everything. There was a comment at the beginning about that bed looks so unique and interesting. And then someone else said, oh no, hold on. This is why I love this group, is because you guys always comment on other people's comments. Kate says that is a classic Kentucky spindle bed. Which
Wonderful.
I did not know that. Well, so here's a question is, obviously the pandemic has kind of thrown all of us off for what we, had planned for whatever, we thought we were going to do in 2020 and maybe even 2021. But as far as for Dinsmore Homestead, what do you guys sort of imagine when groups can come back and things like that? What are your plans moving forward?
Oh, we're kind of hoping for the fall. I don't think we're planning on a fall festival, but we are hoping that maybe some of the school groups will be able to come out in the fall and visit us. And we we used to do a death and dying in October, where we have several accounts and letters of actual deaths that occurred on the farm. So we get actors and reenact those. So it's not a scary thing. It's more of a, let's compare death at different times and how it affected people. So that's one. You can control the audience, how large it is. And that might be something we'll be able to do in October. I don't know. We'd love to do things
all
like
can
that.
Hope, right?
Yes. But we do have tours. We just have people sign up online.
Right. Oh, okay. And what's the website where they can do that?
The website is dinsmorefarm.org, and you just go to calendar, and it has times, and you can reserve a time and a day.
Great. So I just posted in the chat, dinsmorefarm.org. And that was actually, I missed it. That was actually the very first question is, are you open for tours? So we want to make sure that
I actually saw that. I don't know.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, that was even before I think you started. So, well, I think that is all of the questions. This has been fascinating. I have been there. It's been a little while, and I cannot wait for maybe, consistent good weather and to bring my kids out and to see. It's just a really fascinating place, really special. And I think it's really cool that we can really not only understand it as a place, but just the people that live there. And the fact that you're able to do that is really, really interesting. And such a great, Michael Hopkins says, which is what I was going to say, that this has been one of the best presentations. Thank you very much. So, well, we are going to keep next week a little bit of a surprise. So we have some plans. It looks like it's going to be something about Fort Thomas. So we hope everyone will come back and join us. And in the meantime, Cathy, thank you again. And everyone, I hope you guys have a wonderful night.
Thank you,
everybody. Good night.
Good night.
See ya.